Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole, and this is the Wild for Change podcast. Today, we're speaking with Ron Sutherland, Chief Scientist of Wildlands Network, who is their in-house animal and rewilding expert. The mission of Wildlands Network is to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life and all its diversity can thrive. Ron has over 25 years of experience in wildlife research. His extensive knowledge of wildlife and natural spaces provides us with a formidable, fact-based approach towards conservation. A warm welcome and thank you, Ron, for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Nicole. This is great.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this podcast, as I was saying earlier to you, for a while to talk about rewilding. I wanted to start with always the big question: what inspired you into this journey of doing this work?
That's a good question. So for me, I'm a child of the suburbs of the Triangle area of North Carolina. I grew up in Cary. It was a small suburb of Raleigh, the capital of North Carolina. And during the 1980s, when I was a kid, Cary was growing extremely fast, and the 1990s. And basically every little piece of natural forest that was near my house got turned into houses before too long.
Mm.
And particularly there was one tract of woods that was kind of right behind our neighborhood, and it's where we used to, it was convenient, it was where we would go and play as kids with other neighbor kids. And one time we went over there to go play, and it had been totally wrecked and torn down, and it's like mix of sort of red clay North Carolina mud, and then all these stumps of the trees that had been pulled out, and it was going to be basically turned into a big parking lot for a business next door. And so that was just like pretty harsh for me as a young kid to see that, something that I had really enjoyed just be taken away. And then, seeing it happen at scale, and, and watching Cary go from like 17,000 people when I was born to like 120,000 a few decades later, it's just,
Wow.
It wasn't just there, it was just everywhere. And, I'm actually heartened when I go into other parts of the country now that aren't quite as developed, because I see that, that it's not everywhere that's developing quite as fast as this part of North Carolina is, but a lot of places are. And so that kind of drove home to me the need to see what I could do to save places for nature, and so that the other people's special places and other wildlife special places, because there was, one of the first snakes I ever saw was in that forest, and things like that. So, what can I do to make a difference to save some spaces for nature?
Yeah. Wow. That had to be hard because that was like your playground.
Yeah. No, it's definitely seared in the memory.
Yeah, and I think
Everything.
that's sort of traumatic for a child to, where they would go and play and explore and use their imagination, and now it's just turned into a parking lot.
Yeah.
Wow. That's unfortunate, but you see it everywhere. I mean, you can't get away from it no matter where you go. I mean, I live in the Chicagoland area, and Chicagoland is just so sprawling now. I mean, the suburbs just keep moving further and further and further out, where there used to be forests and agriculture too, but everything's getting knocked down for housing and development. So can you explain to the listeners what rewilding means?
Sure. Yeah, I can try. And so rewilding, it's a term that was coined in the early 1990s, I think by Dave Foreman and some of his colleagues. He was one of the founders of Wildlands Network, formerly Wildlands Project. And what he intended was, as an alternative vision of ecological restoration, he wanted rewilding to be restoration, but from the standpoint of sort of letting nature rule and putting things back. And it was based off the idea of wilderness, sort of places where sort of self-willed land, where nature itself would be in charge. and the idea of restoring wilderness. And so rewilding is essentially restoring wilderness, but it has more of a, it's not just the ecosystem and the land, but it's also rewilding is in particular, it's focused on bringing back the species that might be missing. And good friend of mine, John Davis, who's also contemporary with Dave Foreman, co-conspirator with Dave Foreman, a lot of things, and he's the executive director of the Rewilding Institute now. So you should know, but he pretty well. He said rewilding is giving land back to the wildlife and giving wildlife back to the land, and I think that's a great way to put it. It's doing both. We need to give spaces back to wildlife, things that where we've driven species to be extinct or endangered. But also, though, in many cases, the land itself is missing those animals, and so bringing them back is actually going to restore the ecosystems. Gray wolves being the great example,
right?
Out in Yellowstone. So,
and why is that important for us to do that? Why is it so important to bring the wildlife back to these areas?
It's a great question. I think, it's easy sometimes to think that if we just, buy a nice 50-acre national forest, and protect it and keep the bulldozers out, that everything's going to be fine and the plants will keep growing and everything, the birds will visit and it's just going to be good. But the thing that we've realized in the last 30 or 40 years of ecological research is that the way ecosystems are balanced, oftentimes you need the top carnivores, you need those species that are at the top of the food chain to regulate what else goes on. And a big example here in the East and in the Midwest would be white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer, in the absence of any predators or carnivores that are really helping control their populations, then they go to town, they reach really incredible densities, and that has a big impact. And then white-tailed deer, of course, are pretty happy to live in suburbs and sort of suburban parks and natural areas and things. But if they don't have predators, then the deer reach too high of densities, and that can really wipe out all the understory plants, all the native wildflowers, because the deer get hungry in the winter, especially, right. And in the spring they're hungry. And with our trail cameras, it's been one of my interesting lessons looking at trail camera pictures is that if you put a camera out in a section of woods and you watch, when there's a lot of deer around, the deer, you don't see this during the day, but you have a camera out with infrared flash at night, you actually see the deer sort of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And they're really just scouring the land for any little piece of vegetation that they can still eat. A lot of times when you visit a forest in a place that has too many deer and it looks lush and green, it's lush and green with the plants that the deer can't eat. And often those are like some sort of invasive, like stilt grass, like that. And so that's just one example of we need to bring all the species back, and if we want to have these ecosystems actually survive.
Right, and keep that balance. Yeah, I was reading about bringing the wolves back into when they reintroduced them into Yellowstone, and how the elk took over and they overgrazed the land, and a lot of the trees weren't growing because they were eating all of the baby trees and all of this. And so it was like just desecrated in a way. And when they reintroduced the wolves, it restored the ecosystem so much so that like the beavers returned, and it was just like it allowed for the biodiversity to flourish with the apex predator being there.
Right. Yeah, there's a great video that's made the rounds on the internet. Wolves Change Rivers, I think it is. Tying the success of wolf restoration in Yellowstone to the recovery of the riparian vegetation, the willow and the aspen trees. Yeah. Willow are more the riparian tree, and that's what once the trees are back, then the beaver could survive, and the beaver create their ponds, which creates water filtration and creates more habitat. The trout are happier, and it's just an all around ecological sort of miracle. And right. It's also, it's what ecologists would term a atrophic cascade, which is basically, a self-propagating food chain effect that starts at the top and goes down. In this case, in the wolves, by controlling the elk, are definitely influencing the food that the elk were eating. So
Yeah,
it's really cool.
it's very cool, and it's really amazing to see how nature can play out like that, and how it just sort of can take care of things if we're stepping back and letting it do its thing.
Right. And that what you just said is a great way of summing up rewilding. It's kind of the opposite of really management intensive ecological restoration, where you're trying to have humans sort of serve every role in protecting the ecosystem and restoring everything. In rewilding, it's more about returning that management back to nature, and sort of letting evolution run its course, and putting the species back and letting things take care of themselves. And it's I think it's much more efficient to do it that way in many cases than
Right.
trying to manage everything ourselves.
Well, it seems like that just from for myself, an outsider's perspective, that nature really knows best how
Yeah.
how to take care of itself, other than us stepping in all the time. I wanted to ask about, there's a concept called Continental Wildways, and these are the corridors that Wildlands Network has created for conservation projects. Can you share more about that with the listeners?
Yeah. So, back to John Davis, friend of mine. He's the one that coined the term Wildway back in the day. And what he had in mind was, a truly continental scale sort of corridor for wildlife. And when you look at North America, which is where he was focused and where we're focused, some pretty obvious opportunities for continental scale corridors come to light. And one's here on the east, the Eastern Wildway, we call it. You could also call it the Appalachian Wildway, because the Appalachian Mountains form the backbone of a network for nature that could exist basically from Florida all the way up to Quebec. And we've recently completed a new map showing what the Eastern Wildway could look like. And it's not just one corridor, it's actually a network of corridors and core areas. The three C's of rewilding, it's important to bring up. It's the cores, corridors, and carnivores. And the cores are the large natural areas that are big enough to sustain like a population of wolves or mountain lions or other keystone species. And the corridors are what connect those. And then you need the carnivores and or the keystone species, if you pretend that starts with a C. You need those species back to make the ecosystem work once you've restored it. And so what we've done for the Eastern Wildway has been able to map out what that could actually look like, even in the heavily developed East. That there's still this opportunity to create this vision of how all the different natural areas that we've protected in this part of the country, and also including Canada, they could actually still be connected with corridors into a nice network of habitat. And so the Wildway vision, it's one of the tools that we use to help inspire other conservationists to think bigger about what they're doing. Wildlands Network, we don't buy land ourselves, but we like to think that we have some influence over what other folks, where they might be buying land, where they might be protecting land, where they might be working with private landowners to get conservation easements or some sort of voluntary conservation activity. And so the Wildway vision is one of the tools we use for that. The other Wildways, there's the big one that Michael Soule, kind of the father of conservation biology, used to call the spine of the continent, but the Rocky Mountain Wildway, or we call it the Western Wildway sometimes. And that's the Rockies coming up out of Mexico, going up into Canada. And then there's another one, the Pacific Wildway, which is kind of following the Sierra and the coastal ranges and the Cascades along the West Coast. And those are the sort of three prominent mountain-based ones. But then there's certainly cases to be made for additional wildways that you could draw in North America, for like the Mississippi River, for example, and all the great floodplain habitat that used to exist along the Mississippi.
Right.
That river certainly ties together a huge part of the center part of the continent. So yeah, the Wildway concept is just this idea that we can stitch the continent back together using these long north-south corridors. They also have the advantage of being north-south corridors. They have the advantage of being particularly useful for climate change adaptation, because a lot of species need to move in response to this really rapid human-induced climate change we're seeing right now.
Right.
Species need to move, and as it gets warmer, they're going to want to move north. And so having these corridors that run from south to north is really important for that. So lots of good reasons.
So does Wildlands Network, do you collaborate with other people to establish these connections of corridors?
Yeah. So our you know, the way we prefer to work would be to partner with a land trust that's out there buying land, and show them our wildway maps and say, this is this corridor here that goes through this area, for your area of influence, and we would love to work together to try to protect this particular corridor. And that is happening. We've taken our time getting to the point of where we're really getting this implemented. It's a grand vision. I think a lot of people have bought into, but seeing progress on the ground now is really great. There's definitely some good opportunities to mark some progress that we're making.
Oh, that's great.
And then like one of the pieces of the sort of the great Western Wildway, the northern half of that would be better termed Yellowstone Yukon, which is a group that we were affiliated with back in the day, and now it's its own really strong standalone group that's working on connecting sort of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem up into the wilds of Canada, the Yukon. And they've done some great work showing how much conservation has happened within that sort of mega corridor to establish that linkage, so that wildlife can, things like grizzly bears can actually have a firm connection along that northern spine of the whole continent.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's tremendous. I remember visiting Banff, and we were seeing a corridor built across a highway for, wildlife like the bears to get across. How do you work on building corridors where, these species would naturally migrate, but now there's like a 4-lane highway intersecting where they would migrate?
Yeah. So that's actually another big part of what we do at Wildlands Network is focus on getting wildlife across roads. And the one solution is to avoid building new roads in the wrong places, and so we certainly advocate for that. But in many cases, the highway network's already there, and we're focused on healing the wounds of nature and trying to reconnect places. And the way to do that, there's this great tool called a wildlife road crossing, which is what you saw in Banff. And those are actual structures that allow wildlife to go either over or under busy highways. And a lot of times you'd want to put them, from my standpoint, I like to keep them separate from the idea of corridors. Like a corridor is the vegetation that connects one place to another.
Okay.
And in a sense, it's the habitat. And then a wildlife road crossing is where, if a corridor crosses a road and you want the animals to be able to move along that corridor, then you need a crossing structure so the animals can get across. And they really work. They work well, and they work even better. They can actually reduce roadkill by like as much as 90% of wildlife if they use the right kind of fencing, because the fencing sort of steers the animals to the right places, and then they are actually pretty happy to use the crossings. Banff is probably the best studied set of wildlife crossings in the world. Huge set of them up there on the Trans-Canadian Highway that goes right through the middle of the national park.
Yes, it does.
That's a core area in my lingo here. And they had this road going right through the core area, which is really bad for the grizzly bears there and the wolves and everything else.
Yeah.
So when they were 4-laning that road, they had the wisdom to think maybe we could actually do something better for wildlife. So they put up these crossings, they put up the fencing, and if they the funny thing is that if they had gone out and studied those crossings for 3 years, they would have seen that not that much was using them, especially in terms of like the grizzly bears. But then years 4 and 5 is when the bears actually found them and really started using them.
Okay.
And then, now years later, they've actually been able to document that, once the mother bears find these crossings, they're actually teaching it to their cubs, and they have intergenerational knowledge and culture of how to get across this busy highway. That's the great thing about intelligent mammals like that. They can really teach each other how to do these things. And so there's just been this great uptick in wildlife using those crossings. So really great success story.
I'm glad to know that. I was going to ask, like, how do you help support the wildlife to know that those crossings are there? I would be on pins and needles thinking about, okay, how long is it going to take them to find it?
Yeah, well, there's a really funny radio interview somewhere. This lady who calls in and complains that somebody put up a deer crossing sign in the wrong place, and why don't they just move the sign so that they can get the deer to cross somewhere else? And that is not the way to do that. No, the wildlife are going to want to cross the road where they want to cross, and so it's up to us to use science. We get out there and we track the animals with GPS collars. You put up cameras in the woods along the road and see where the hot spots of activity are. And then the less fun job is to go out and count the dead animals on the road and see where they're actually getting hit.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
We've done all those things at Wildlands Network for different projects, and put it all together, and it gives you a pretty good idea. This spot right here is where we really need a wildlife crossing to be put in, and then and usually it's in an area that's fairly natural. It's not just one crossing. You need systems of crossings, because you don't just want to fence things off. It's important for wildlife to be able to move freely across these roads, and so rather than thinking of one big crossing, it's quite important to put out lots of them in a series with fencing between them, so you can really return some semblance of habitat connectivity across that road.
Right.
So yeah, we see roads as a huge part of the barrier to wildlife movement in North America. So trying to fix those is a big thing. And Wildlands Network has been one of the groups that has pushed really hard for there's actually a pilot program, wildlife crossings pilot program, in President Biden's infrastructure bill. And we helped push for that, $350 million to build wildlife crossings over 5 years. Turns out that's not even very much money.
I was going to ask if that was even enough. Yeah.
No, it's nowhere near enough, but it's the first really dedicated investment by the federal government in building these, in helping states build these crossings. It's a competitive grant program. We just had the first round of applications that came in August 1st, and we were involved in a number of those, and trying to get states to pick the places in their state that are the highest priority or the best opportunity for putting in crossings and getting some of those funded. And I think what we're going to find is that the need, I think the number of applications they got is greatly going to exceed the number of how much money there is. And because anybody that's driven around the countryside knows roadkill is a really extensive problem.
It's terrible, and I don't know how many millions of animals get killed each year. And you don't even want to think about it because it's so horrific, and like how much we've encroached into their natural migration routes, and where they're used to looking for food, and now they're having to deal with a big car coming both ways and having to cross traffic. It's just awful.
Yeah, but the encouraging thing about wildlife crossings is that they have a surprising degree of bipartisan support, sort of cross-cultural in the U.S. Like so far, I really haven't run into anybody that's just strongly opposed to building crossings for getting animals across highways, because there's nobody that really wants to see animals slaughtered and left on the road by cars.
Right.
I guess vultures are the only lobby group that really like they really like roadkill, but everybody else. And so it's states with all kinds of different politics are being really excited about building wildlife crossings. So
that's good to hear, and that's huge progress. Even have it, the infrastructure there to create these crossings for the wildlife within our federal government is a massive step forward.
Mm-hmm. That's
wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for supporting all of that.
Of course.
You and Wildlands Network. That's great news. I'm very happy to hear. How much land do you think, how much more land do we need to reconnect to help wildlife not only survive but thrive?
That's a great question. and much keener minds than I have contemplated it for decades now. And I think, Edward O. Wilson, one of the great heroes of the conservation movement, published a book
Yeah.
back in 2016, making a case for half Earth, protecting half of protecting half of the Earth's natural areas, including the oceans too.
Right.
And with the goal of saving, say, 85-90% of the Earth's species. And I think that's based on relationships between species and area that he and others observed on islands. As you get islands of different sizes, as the islands get bigger, they get more and more species. You can actually calculate, sort of ramp that up to the entire Earth and say how much of the Earth should we protect and set aside for wildlife and for natural ecosystems. And the answer is at least half.
Right.
And it's not that people can't live in that half. It's definitely not that people can't enjoy that half of the thing. But if we want to have clean water and functioning ecosystems, and we want to have all these species of wildlife survive, then a network of habitat that covers something like half of the U.S., half of North America, I think is really essential. And that's what our Eastern Wildway map was intentionally designed to illustrate what half Earth could look like for this side
Oh,
of the thing.
okay.
So it does actually cover about half of the lands and waters of the East Coast. And I think it's a beautiful vision. I think most people, if they think about it, would like to live in a place. It would actually it would do wonders for the global real estate market in a sense, but for everybody wants to live in a place that's protected in that way and that's going to stay natural and beautiful. Nobody wants to live in a place that it's just going to be overrun and things. So I think it's not so much that people don't want to live in that kind of sort of visionary future world. It's just we don't know how to get there from where we are now, which is a society that's really stuck on growth and stuck on development as a major economic activity, as opposed to we should probably be stuck on restoration as a major economic activity, because it really could be a source of income for a lot of people, restoring our ecosystems, bringing nature back, and creating a world that we actually want to live in.
Right. I think our priorities are upside down.
Yes.
And then for so many reasons. I mean, one reason is just living on a healthy planet for everybody. That's the basis of how we're all here, is, being maintained by nature.
Yeah. Too easy to forget as we
Right.
drive to the grocery store and back and things, just how dependent we are on actual natural ecosystems and ecosystem functions like pollination, the bees, all the native bees that we need to be saving, not just the honeybee, but all the native bees and wasps and everything. They do all the pollinating of our plants. We can't lose those things. We can't do that ourselves. So
Right.
we really need to think about water quality, water regeneration, and groundwater recharge. You need natural areas to do that. You can't pave everything.
You can't pave over everything, right? Yeah, because then there's no resource for the water, like you said, for the recharge. If the water has nowhere to go when it does rain, it's just falling on pavement. It can't be absorbed by the land. We just lost that ability to have that as a source of water for ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's a great vision, Half Earth, and I love the blueprint that Wildlands Network created for the eastern side along the Appalachians to show what is possible. I think that's great foresight.
Yeah. No, we're proud of that. Proud of that effort, and I'm hoping my kids and their kids might get to see that the implementation progress being much further along as we go. And we've protected a lot of things in this country, and a lot of what's missing is the connections between those protected areas.
Yeah.
And so if we can really focus on that for a generation of protecting the habitat connectivity, then that'll get us pretty far. But we also need to put the species back, things like the red wolf and the Florida panther, eastern cougar, and things like that in the east. There's lots of room for grizzly bear reintroductions out west. California, sort of looking at you there, and
right.
the so that there's lots to do in the west. There's a lot of public land already, and in many ways, I think the west, if we could just protect that public land from being destroyed, from mining and oil and gas exploration and so forth, and keep the habitat on that public land, then we're actually at or even slightly above the 50% threshold in large parts of the Western US.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's great.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, if we could stay that way.
Right. We got to keep it that way. So it's a lot of defense out west.
Right.
But in the East and the Midwest, there's a lot of restoration that needs to happen. We need to be replanting the tall grass prairies on the upper Midwest.
Oh, for sure.
Restoring
Yeah.
those native grasslands. And in the Southeast, it's the longleaf pine ecosystem that was like the tall grass, the longleaf pine savannas, which in some ways is more a grassland than a forest. And those were just decimated by the arrival of Europeans and all the stuff that we've done there. So there's just a huge amount of ecological restoration that needs to happen in this country, and I hope we can get that going.
I hope so too.
The Wildway vision is a kind of a roadmap for how you could do that, how you could protect and restore corridors, where to put the road crossings so the animals can get from one place to the next, and just really tie it all together.
Yeah, it just takes foresight, planning, and actual knowing that, okay, well, we can't continue to live this way and continue to just destroy these areas for the sake of development. There's got to be some, like I said, foresight into how we approach our future. For not just us, but for the wildlife, for everybody.
Right. I mean, it's the parable about when we get society to a place where people are planting trees that they're never going to sit in the shade of the tree. That's that kind of wisdom that we need in this culture right now. It's definitely missing.
I agree.
In a lot of ways, but I think some of us have it. I hope, and I think that as we grow the movement, I think more and more people are going to catch on to the idea that we actually can, recover nature on this continent and all the other continents too. So,
right, and you're already leading the way. So,
lots of great partners.
Yeah.
Lots of great people working on this. So,
yeah. Can you tell us about the rewilding of the red wolves?
Yeah, and I've been involved with red wolves for a while. I was kind of a kid in North Carolina when they actually first reintroduced the wolves. But the red wolf was the original wolf of the Southeast, as far as we know, and they kind of went up into possibly as far north as New York. It's really hard to draw that line now.
Oh, wow.
100 years later. But the wolves on the East Coast were wiped out by settlers fairly quickly. I think the last wolves in North Carolina were lost probably by around the year 1900, 1905. And, it seemed like the red wolf was headed to extinction, much like the Carolina parakeet or the ivory-billed woodpecker. But then in the 1960s, there's a really big flash of environmentalism and passion for saving the environment. And that translated into the US government launching, I think 1966, the precursor to the Endangered Species Act. And one of the first species that they decided to designate as endangered was the red wolf. And they weren't even sure at that point if there were any red wolves left to save. Wow. Same with Florida panthers. They didn't know if Florida panthers were still out there or not. They went and looked, and they luckily found a few red wolves, and they found a few Florida panthers. And the red wolves they found were in these coastal marshes down on the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, in that little corner. And it's probably not great red wolf habitat, but that's where the last little safe haven was. The Rivendell for the red wolves. And even that wasn't very safe, because the last few wolves were surrounded by invading coyotes that were coming in to take over the niche that was left by the wolves. I don't personally think that the coyotes can fill that niche very well. not without a whole lot of evolving in the meantime. But and so these wolves were on the Gulf Coast. The federal government decided that the best thing for them to do was actually to go and catch the last red wolves, put them in captivity, and then find a way to restore them somewhere else where they could be more protected.
Mm-hmm.
And this was back when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was particularly considerably more bold, I think, than they are now after decades of abuse from Congress. And so they brought the wolves in captivity, declared them extinct in the wild in 1980. By 1987, they were ready to start releasing them again, and they picked Eastern North Carolina because they thought it was pretty far away from the coyotes. And there was a big new national wildlife refuge called Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, over 100,000 acres. They thought that could support a fairly large population of red wolves, which is a bit of an overestimate. But and so they did. They just went ahead and returned the wolves. And it was actually the first case of a top carnivore being restored from extinction in the wild anywhere in the world. And so for that, we can be proud. We can be not proud of the fact that we destroyed so much of the wolves' habitat, shot all the wolves' food and everything else to nearly drive them to extinction. But we can be proud that somebody back in the 60s and 70s was brave enough to stand up for this species and save them just really at the brink of extinction. And so they put them back in North Carolina, and the population actually grew, did pretty well. That effort served as the model for what they did in Yellowstone. The Yellowstone wolves were returned to 1995. And so they had the benefit of learning from the Red Wolf program. And, if you ask people about wolf restoration, they're going to tell you about gray wolves, but the red wolf was actually the first. And it's been much quieter. It has, for most of the time, red wolves were not that controversial. Unfortunately, around 2012, there were some political shifts in North Carolina, and some local folks decided to kind of use that opportunity to see if they could rid themselves of the sort of federal red wolf program. And so they kind of launched a misinformation campaign, and people started shooting the wolves again. And it's one of the interesting differences between wolves and coyotes in the history, in the historical context of the United States, is that pretty much anywhere in the U.S. where sort of modern settlers decided to get rid of wolves, they were able to do so. The wolves just are too big and too dignified, and they have just too much of a sense that they were at the top of the ecosystem. That makes them really easy to get rid of, unfortunately. But then everywhere we've tried to get rid of coyotes, it has not worked. And coyotes sort of laugh in our face, and they outbreed our attempts to eradicate them and everything else. But the folks in North Carolina, eventually coyotes showed up, and people are kind of still reacting badly to that thing. And there's the Nextdoor app that many people are on, sort of neighborhood app.
Yeah.
So every other week, somebody's complaining that they heaven forbid saw a coyote in their neighborhood, and so people are very reactive to coyotes, and that included the people down in the Red Wolf area in North Carolina. And it came to pass that the State Wildlife Commission actually tried to allow nighttime coyote hunting in the Red Wolf area, which would have been kind of a huge disaster for the red wolves. And some environmental groups fought them off. Southern Environmental Law Center and other groups sort of fought that off and had a settlement that said, no, you can't do nighttime hunting for coyotes in this area because you can't tell by spotlight.
Right.
Yeah, you can't tell a wolf from a coyote. Red wolves are smaller than gray wolves. They're kind of in between size between coyotes and gray wolves. And so nobody could tell. So they stopped it, but that was like the perfect opportunity for a backlash against the wolves. And so unfortunately, from 2012 to like 2020 or so, the wolf population went from like 120, which is not that much.
It's not many.
No, but it went down to about 8 again.
Come on.
And so, so the history of the Red Wolf Rewilding program is one of cycles, and that was a really harsh cycle to have experienced firsthand, because that's when I was working on it. And The yeah, the wolves were very nearly driven extinct in the wild again. There's a captive
After all of
population.
that work
Yes,
to
yeah,
to bring them back, and then only for them to get decimated once again.